moving away from the colonial liberal constitutional approach, or whether it is whether it's kind of still incorporating the same approaches of private and public dichotomy, whereby the private sphere will be left out. But also I think I quite like the idea of Moyes when he said that we need to move away, and we're the presupposition that it is the liberal constitutional paradigm with which we approach the constitution, we have to move away. But how do we move away from there is my question to him on that front. And also I'm quite sure that everybody has questions here. I find it very difficult to disagree with Dr. Uday Shankar when he's talking about the responsibility of the state and the need that that we did not have a private superiority of the one or the other, and we certainly have to talk in terms of ensuring the people's will to be heard through that. And I'm quite sure that people would have a different opinion on that. But to Nupur, I have one question, clarification more rather than anything else. That your basic argument was that the Supreme Court has narrowed down the possibilities of more development in the environmental law, focusing on the PIL approach. And then you did also mention two sections in the Water Act where limitations have been put in the people's approaching the courts for a remedy. And for me, it seems like that, to me, as a person who has recently been educated on the subject, that when we look at the Supreme Court, we are looking at Supreme Courts. There are two ways for the Supreme Court to take cognizance of matters. One will be that somebody approaches the court, or some matter appears and the court takes full motor cognizance of it in the PIL category. So in both the categories, they can do what is before them. Either it came to them because of the newspaper publication or somebody approached them, or the second will be that. So that's the only way. They cannot kind of suo moto say, okay, such and such concept, such and such section is obstructive, is not good, unless somebody goes to the court and says, please challenge these sections. Court cannot say, in my PIL take up this and say these limitations should go. So at one level, we are recognizing in our presentation that there are inbuilt limitations in the legislation themselves, because of which ordinary people cannot approach the ordinary courts for remedies. And therefore, in the various manners, even when they have not been able to give specific relief in the particular case, they've still opened up the discussion by deep pocket, for example. So in that sense, can we say that the Supreme Court tried what it could within this system that it has, because it cannot really go out. I'm quite sure that many more questions, and you can take note. I will take some questions together. People who are wanting to make observations, comments are also welcome, but make sure that these are not turning into presentations, so that more and more people can participate. So please, yes please.
I have a question for Professor Dhiman Sena. So you mentioned that right to propagation is no longer there in the 80s Constitution. So can you explain why? And you said it was there earlier, now it's not. So can you talk a bit about the debates that took place in the Parliament perhaps?
I'm just wondering, can we take 2-3 questions and then answer? Any other questions for anybody? Yes, please.
Yeah, this question is addressed to Professor Uday. I agree with you when you refer to the responsibility of the state. See, it's just responsible of the state to ensure the compliance of social economic rights. But when it comes to practice, state is facilitating like private entities to violate social economic rights, like in case of guaranteed wages, minimum wages. Then there are certain protections which are available to workers, like Article 40 to Article 43. So state is facilitating private entities, outsourcing its responsibility. So my question is, how to ensure the accountability of the state for ignoring these social economic rights?
Yes, please.
My first question is to Nupur. When the court is confronted with a situation where it has to decide on what the executive calls as economic development and what other can proposes as being against environment, and you said that the court has generally been deferential to the executive. Now, is there any test which the court has developed in being deferential to the executive? Because in a constitutional scheme of things, the court has to show the required due deference to the state. The court cannot sort of start from the presumption that the state is always wrong or the executive is always wrong. So is there any test which the court has evolved in that regard? And my other point is to Uday. I completely agree with you on the argument of the requirement of economic resources. I think even the most ardent free market advocates do not say that state intervention should not be there. I think what we don't discuss enough is the nature of this state intervention. I'll just give you a very small example. We have the National Food Security Act, which has been enacted to give right to food to a large number of people. Now, what is the nature of intervention there? The nature of intervention is that the state will provide subsidized food through public distribution shops. Now, when the state, in other words, the state will introduce subsidies. Now, when you introduce subsidies, you distort the market. The same amount of money can be spent and the intervention can be made by having something like a direct cash transfer to the consumer, who can then go and buy food from any shop via public distribution shop. So I think we need to focus a little more on this nature of intervention rather than just arguing that state needs to intervene for social economics, for the fulfillment of social economics.
So I have two questions from Nupur, but maybe later I'll get a chance to ask questions more on that. The two questions, one stemmed from what Professor Ved Kumari said.
I was actually thinking that you should ask Mohit, so everybody would have a question each.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Mohit, on one of the points, which is the government in parliament, it seems to be your test for it is the intention of the Constituent Assembly. So one could be, what kind of test do we now have for, thinking that this was the intention of the Constituent Assembly? One, you have indicated that we actually look at what people said at the Constituent Assembly. But I was also wondering that is there some objective way of looking at it through interpretive materials, that how does this proposition that they wanted to exclude the judiciary go along with other things which figure in the Constitution, like some amount of separation of powers, the three lists that are there in the Constitution where they could make laws, and on very similar things, the court could still challenge them. And how does it go along with questions like federalism? So do you think that it is enough to say that there were these remarks made which makes a case for thinking that the Constituent Assembly wanted to exclude? Or do you think that you need to justify it on the basis of the constellation of other concepts that are there in the Constitution which would support your proposition?
I have just one question about religion. Actually, the proposed draft included right to propagate constitutions, right to propagate religion, but later, after they went to the people, and most of the people, they rejected the concept of even secularism, and they said Nepal should remain in the state. But after collecting all the opinion from the people, even they deliberated conceptually and by implications as well. And finally, they dropped the word propagation because in Nepal, the problem within this decade, especially is of the expansion of Christianity, and they pay money, especially to establish the church, and the people are, especially poor people, they are getting converted to Christian. Because of that, keeping in mind the fear, they just dropped out the concept of propagation. Of course, there is a right to freedom of religion, which includes both non-establishment clause and free exercise clause. Actually, state is like in India, supporting all the religions equally. It is not religion neutral. And also there are some rights to the religious sects, especially to purchase and to administer the religious entities. There are two types: individual right to religion and corporate right to religion in terms of administering its properties and trust. That sort of provisions are now there, but they have dropped the idea of right to propagation of religions because of that. Thank you. And I don't know what Professor Ved Kumari was asking me, your questions to me.
I was actually congratulating you on the eve of your constitution. But also, no, the question which I didn't ask, I still have is, how many women were there in the Constituent Assembly? Because I think the initially proposed was there will be 1/3 women in the Constituent Assembly, but they were not the same numbers.
Yes, now there are 28% among 597. But now this constitution, the upcoming constitution, has guaranteed that if there are the 33% of women are not elected, by way of proportional representation, all the political parties have duty to nominate them to maintain the 33% of seats in the parliament. That is now mandatory.
We certainly need to learn something from Nepal here.
So I'll start with your question. I agree with you to a large extent, but there have been many instances in which the Supreme Court has actually shown the imagination to go beyond an Article 21 interpretation. And there have been instances like the Bichri village case, for instance, in which the court actually asked the state of Rajasthan not to oppose class action suit by those villagers. It has sent it back to the Rajasthan High Court to allow that suit to be filed. For instance, there is another instance that I can give you in which the case is called Srinivas Distillery, in which the Andhra Pradesh High Court allowed there's a section 58 which under the Water Act, which says that unless the complaint goes through the process under the Water Act. So you have a SPCB complaint, then there is an appellate authority, only then can it go to the court. So the court actually disregarded that section and reinterpreted it to say that no, we will allow complaints to come to us. This cannot, section 58 cannot bar public nuisance suit when there is a violation under the Water Act. So there have been instances in which different courts, as well as the Supreme Court itself, has actually looked at these kind of problems with statutory remedies and has come up with different kind of reinterpreted it to do away with the curves, right? So what I want the Supreme Court to do is much more. That's my limited argument that I'm making. Okay. The other question that Prabhash put about deference, is there a test of deference? My reading of it would be that largely there have been two criteria. One is a very straightforward, you can't call it a criteria, but if there has been a huge public investment in something, the court is very, very reluctant, and there has been a long period of time the court is very reluctant to step in and do something about it, even if there have been massive violations, environmental violations, statutory violations. Second is a very clean utilitarian perspective, which is good for the greatest number of people. So a dam benefits a huge number of people. Some tribal communities may be affected, but we give them land somewhere else. So that has been the larger perspective that Supreme Court takes in these kind of instances. Until unless its conscience is completely shaken, if there is a blatant violation, and that blatant violation test is very high, for it to be blatant enough for the Supreme Court to step in and to make a positive, positive balance in favor of environment and to disregard economic development. So, I mean, you can't call it a test of deference, but by and large, these two factors have been very important for the Supreme Court to come to judgment on cases like this.
May I ask one question to you? You have focused on 3 cases.
Only 3 cases.
Only 3 cases and excluded Bishari Mines case. I thought only Bishari Mine case alone, the 15-year journey of Bishari Mine case, would have given you everything about being the people, the kind of justice, injustice, abuse of process that is involved in environmental jurisprudence. You did not have referred to Goda Burman and the other William Jasly case, which has nothing as compared to Bishari Mine case. So why did you not focus on this and not include it in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a a good enough answer for that, except that this is a very long case as well and
No,
very
long,
interesting. And
because it has everything.
yeah, that's
The abuse of judgment of justice, the Bhandari, and the kind of abuse, the people involved. You know, in Bichari Mine's case, lawyers earned more than 5 crore rupees from one case only.
yeah,
And they were only doing Bichari Mine case. So, to defeat the purpose of environmental jurisdiction, the whole purpose was defeated. The money was never paid.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is environmental jurisdiction, that is we the people.
Let me take up the question which Nivas has put up first. You are right when you say that market has got problem when you see that what the state is providing for comes in your way, comes in on the way of the market. But then when you give the example of Food Security Act, we also need to look at that the state needs to also examine infrastructural support available with the state in order to provide socio-economic rights. Whether it should be in the form of subsidy or it should be in the form of cash transfer. I'm just taking that example. When a state makes a law, a state needs to look at this fact also, that how the state can be successful in making that right implemented. And for that, the state cannot ignore the infrastructural support available on the ground. Now, market can give advice to the state, but then the state is not bound to go by the advice which does not conform to the reality. And many times it may happen when market looks at only its own interest and ignore the reality within the state, and which is precisely what socio-economic rights is trying to address. That look at reality and then strategize about it. Then only strategy should be built. And where there is a conflict, which is not a conflict, which shouldn't be a conflict, but there where the conflict is visible, and we need to negotiate it. For example, let's say now when we talk about right to shelter, we have a bill coming up wherein the government is trying to regulate even the sector, and market proponents can argue that why you are unnecessarily intervening into this. But then we have to have some honor to socio-economic rights, and therefore we can think of this kind of regulation, and where market may feel pinched, but then everyone must submit to the cause of rights. My response to the question put up by Professor Maan, if I'm not wrong, you are talking that the government is outsourcing the responsibility, and you are giving an example of Minimum Wages Act. I would take the same act and establish the case that how this Minimum Wages Act advances the cause of socio-economic rights. When you look at the formula for fixation of the wage, it is primarily based on what the employer needs to pay to preserve the labor, and there is a scientific formula for that. There is a calorie, there is a requirement of clothes, everything. Now, what is important for socio-economic right is that a state shall ensure that what is being guaranteed for socio-economic need must be fulfilled, whether through state agency or through private agency.
It is not available, it is confined to both. Practice.
Now, when you say practice, we must not forget that it's just 7 decades of our constitution, and we are doing wonderful. 48 we have enacted Minimum Wages Act. We have started thinking about labor welfare way back in either just a year after independence or even before 1946 we have employment standing order act. So what I am highlighting is that when you look at practice, we need to also look at the one who is made responsible to enforce. There again, you will find that the enforcement is largely with executive authority. The one who is made responsible to implement all these labor laws, they are extended arms of the state. Now, how to make them accountable? I think there is a larger issue involved there. And some of the issues you deal with, for example, corruption and other governance issues. Now, whether those issues can be brought in within the ambit of discussion of socioeconomic rights and resources, I would say yes. Why? Because it is ultimately the end result what you have to look at. So, it has not been followed in practice. Therefore, there is a suggestion which is being made that we need to also liberalize this governance pattern, and which is a debate going on in labor law. That instead of having complete control of the state, let's look at more regulatory approach, where the state should only be supervising. So this kind of changes are happening. I hope that which we were talking in the morning with Professor Pandey, that we should not only talk about rhetoric, let the thing get translated into reality also. Gradually it's happening, and I'm very hopeful that with this kind of constitution we'll be able to succeed.
To your question first, ma'am, the liberal paradigm needs to be, we need to move beyond the liberal paradigm. And how do we do it? I mean, there is this definite hegemony of liberal constitutional thinking which has pervaded lawyerly accounts of constitutions in different ways, like, you know, common law constitutionalism, as though it is, you know, it is liberal way of studying. It is the be all and end all of common law constitutionalism as an idea which we have sort of inherited and continue to inherit. Now, if we look beyond the purview of law to other disciplines such as history, political science, philosophy, and do constitutional theory in their intersection, in the intersection of these disciplines, I think there are sufficient resources, rich resources available to start building an alternative sort of constitutional theory, which would give a better account of our constitutional reality. So what I do, my PhD project, is would try to understand the nature of constituent power in the light of how the social question has been dealt with. So I want to shift away from, you know, understanding constitutional form to make sense of and move away to discuss constitutional identity and take that as the starting point, and then within its light discuss constitutional forms. So one way of, I mean, moving away from liberal constitutionalism, a simple answer would be what I was trying to say at the end, that, you know, public law thinking in Europe itself has moved much beyond liberal constitutionalism, where they have kind of acknowledged the social interdependence as the founding premise of constitutional or public law thinking. We can take that we can continue that sort of tradition, because that is, I mean, the idea of state having to perform positive duties is something that, you know, Professor Singh always kept on emphasizing in our constitutional law classes. So there is enough material that we can draw from that tradition, and then use the distinctiveness or lack thereof within our own political system, the emphasis on democracy that I was making, and try to see if we can work towards maybe from liberal constitutionalism to social constitutionalism, so to speak, however crude the terminology may sound. As far as Nepal is concerned, I think I agree. I mean, I would definitely say that the long and short of the answer is that when I say that spiritual and political, spiritual and material is as a category, is not exclusively something that applies to India, but the larger subcontinent on the whole. So, I mean, of course, Nepal did not have that sort of a colonial experience, and so there is a possibility that you know, their indigenous thinking is kept intact in that sense. So, I mean, as himself mentioned, the way in which they kind of try to think about socio-economic rights, signifies that probably they don't take the public-private divide seriously at all. Now to Preetham's question. I am completely with you on the bit about constellation of other constitutional concepts which definitely have a bearing on constitutional thinking. But even in this regard, the point that you mentioned about federalism, I mean, if you look at what was happening around the time the constitution was being framed, the emphasis was absolutely on creation of one singular imperium. These are Ambedkar's words. So to begin with, the idea of federalism was maybe, for administrative convenience, we need to devolve some sort of powers, which was a colonial governmentality sort of a thing. But later on, it was realized that one way of quelling dissent would be by reorganizing states on the basis of language. But increasingly over the years, we have seen how the lists have been continually amended to sort of give more and more powers to the union. And even the judiciary, for that matter, has supported the unionist stance. I mean, the way in which Indian political system has federalized over the years has got very little to do with the constitution. I mean, this is a provocative claim, but the only component of the constitution which has had a bearing on its federalization is the emphasis on democracy. So, I mean, I work in the intersection of these concepts for sure, and when I make the claim about the social question, it is not merely a singular sort of study. I mean, I completely believe that, single concept studies are, you may get a lot of analytical clarity with respect to refining the concept more and more, but it kind of loses out on its on the richness and the complexity within the debate. So my work is not just about the social question with respect to the economic democracy, but also with respect to, say, for example, caste and religion. And I understand that intention of the Constituent Assembly is one thing, and the context and structures within which they were trying to operate is another thing, which they were absolutely not in a position to, maybe they were not in a position to control, which they of course tried to, but sometimes, constitution is absolutely an imperfect estimation of the power arrangements in a political system.
I think given the time frame that we have on the schedule, I will pass a second round, and you can continue your questioning at lunchtime. Everybody can, I'll pass it on. And I think it's been I certainly believe that it's been a very, very interesting session, and everybody has done honors to Professor M.P. Singh's thinking processes, which has really created a lot of critical thinking minds. And I'm very glad about it that I've been able to learn and focus a few more things which sometimes don't come to the fore. As a concluding remark, I want to just kind of make this title, focus on the title itself, which is saying we the people and free market economy. So as one of the people of India, I can relate to the free market economy impact in the lines of consumerism and objectification of women. When I was young, Shikakai Sabun was the topmost for your hair care. Then we moved on to shampoos, then we moved on to conditioners. Now you need to have all kinds of hair products just to get your hair straight. And whether it is selling a motorbike, or whether it is selling a car or selling a household product, it is the patriarchal values which are getting reinforced, and we are bombarded with all of them. So who has this control? Because when it comes to profit making in free market economy, advertisement is a very, very important source of that profit making. And unless there is any control of quality of the what kind of advertisements are or what kind of values are being reinforced into the advertisements, we the people get impacted very, very heavily and very negatively. So it might be good for the economy, but I do not think it is good for we the people. And we say we the people, I certainly mean the women whose life have become much more dangerous in today's on the today's streets because of the objectification of women, sexualization of women. And I certainly think that we need to think a lot more in terms of the individuals who are getting impacted. Because what we have been focusing has been the policy, the constitutional questions, the theoretical analysis, which is all good. But I think certainly we need to, I certainly look at law as to how does it impact the day-to-day life of individuals in the real life. And I would hope that some other sessions will focus on those questions as to how this critical studies impact or improves upon and brings about a change in the real life situations of the real people, and especially the marginalized and the powerless and those who have been always differently against. Thank you very much for this. Thank you to all the panelists for a very, very interesting session. And thank you to all of you for your participation.